What if I told you that hidden beneath centuries of church doctrine lies a forbidden account of Jesus' final hours that was deemed so dangerous, so theologically explosive, that it was banned from Christian communities before the New Testament was even finalized? Tonight, we're diving into one of Christianity's most controversial suppressed texts, the Gospel of Peter, a document so radical in its claims about Christ's crucifixion and resurrection that early church fathers went to extraordinary lengths to ensure it would never see the light of day. Most Christians have never heard of this gospel, and there's good reason for that. This isn't just another collection of Jesus' teachings or parables. This is a visceral, supernatural account of the passion that presents a version of events so dramatically different from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John that it threatens to upend everything you thought you knew about the crucifixion story. We're talking about a text that depicts Jesus emerging from the tomb as a giant, followed by a talking cross that bears witness to his resurrection. But here's what makes this story truly fascinating. The Gospel of Peter wasn't just some fringe document written by an obscure sect. Evidence suggests it was circulating widely in early Christian communities, read and revered by believers who considered it authentic apostolic teaching. Yet by the end of the 2nd century, church authorities had declared it heretical and forbidden its use entirely. Why? What was so threatening about this alternative passion narrative that it had to be eliminated from Christian history? Before we uncover the shocking contents of this forbidden gospel, I need you to understand something crucial. What you're about to discover isn't just ancient history. This suppressed text reveals the intense theological battles that raged in early Christianity, battles that determined which version of Jesus' story would survive and which would be buried forever. The Gospel of Peter represents one of the most significant casualties in that war for Christian orthodoxy. My investigation into this banned text has uncovered details that will challenge your understanding of how the crucifixion story developed, why certain theological interpretations were deemed acceptable while others were condemned, and how political considerations shaped the formation of Christian doctrine. This isn't just about recovering a lost gospel. This is about understanding how institutional Christianity was forged through the systematic suppression of alternative voices. The Gospel of Peter was discovered in the winter of 1886 by French archaeologists excavating a monk's tomb in Akhmim, Egypt. What they found was a parchment codex containing a fragmentary account of Jesus' passion that bore little resemblance to the familiar gospel narratives. The text began abruptly in the middle of Jesus' trial and ended just as dramatically with confused guards fleeing from an empty tomb. But even in its incomplete state, this gospel contained elements so extraordinary that scholars immediately recognized they were dealing with something unprecedented. The manuscript itself was written in Greek, dating to somewhere between the 6th and 9th centuries, but the text it preserved was much older. Internal evidence and early church references suggest the original Gospel of Peter was composed in the mid to late 2nd century, making it potentially contemporary with some of the canonical Gospels themselves. This wasn't some medieval fabrication or late legendary development. This was an early Christian document that had been deliberately hidden from history. What makes the Gospel of Peter so controversial begins with its very first surviving lines. Unlike the canonical Gospels, which present Pontius Pilate as the Roman governor who ultimately sentences Jesus to death, this forbidden text dramatically shifts the blame. Here, Pilate washes his hands not just symbolically, but literally removes himself from any responsibility for Jesus' execution. The Jewish king Herod and the Jewish leaders become the primary antagonists, depicted as bloodthirsty enemies determined to destroy Jesus regardless of Roman hesitation. This shift in narrative focus wasn't accidental. The Gospel of Peter reflects a growing trend in second-century Christianity to distance the faith from its Jewish origins and make it more palatable to Gentile, particularly Roman, audiences. By portraying Pilate as reluctant and Herod as the villain, the text attempts to absolve Roman authority while intensifying anti-Jewish sentiment. This theological repositioning would have profound implications for how Christianity developed its relationship with both Jewish communities and Roman political power. But the real shock comes when we examine how the Gospel of Peter describes Jesus' experience of crucifixion itself, in a passage that sent early church theologians into theological panic. The text suggests that Jesus did not suffer in the way a normal human being would. During his torture and execution, Jesus remains mysteriously silent, described as being as if he felt no pain. This isn't just Stoic endurance. This is something far more theologically radical. The Gospel of Peter appears to embrace what scholars call Docetic Christology, the belief that Jesus only appeared to have a physical human body, but was actually pure spirit. According to this view, Jesus' suffering was essentially an illusion, a divine performance rather than genuine human agony. While this might seem like a minor theological distinction, it struck at the very heart of Christian doctrine about the incarnation and atonement. Think about the implications of this claim. If Jesus didn't truly suffer as a human being, then what meaning does his sacrifice hold? How can his death serve as atonement for human sin if he didn't experience genuine human pain? The docetic elements in the Gospel of Peter threaten to undermine the entire theological foundation that early church fathers were trying to establish about Jesus' dual nature as both fully human and fully divine. The Forbidden Gospel's most spectacular departure from canonical tradition comes in its description of the resurrection itself. Where Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John provide relatively restrained accounts of the empty tomb discovery, the Gospel of Peter unleashes a supernatural spectacle that reads more like divine science fiction than traditional religious narrative. According to this banned text, the resurrection doesn't happen quietly in the pre-dawn darkness. Instead, it occurs as a cosmic event witnessed by Roman guards, Jewish elders, and crowds of onlookers. The scene unfolds with the heavens opening, 2 angels descending to the tomb, and the stone rolling away by itself. But then comes the moment that must have left early readers stunned. Jesus emerges from the tomb, but not as the familiar figure from canonical accounts. The Gospel of Peter describes Jesus rising from the dead as a giant, so tall that his head reaches beyond the clouds. Behind him emerge 2 other figures, presumably the angels who had descended earlier, but they too are of supernatural proportions. The image is both majestic and terrifying, a vision of divine power that dwarfs anything in the canonical resurrection accounts. But perhaps the most bizarre element in this supernatural spectacle is what happens next. As this giant Jesus and the 2 angels emerge from the tomb, they are followed by a cross, not carried by someone, but walking on its own, apparently alive and conscious. The cross then begins to speak, answering questions posed by a voice from heaven about Jesus' ministry to the dead. This scene of a talking cross engaging in dialogue about Jesus' descent into hell represents one of the most unique elements in early Christian literature. The cross becomes not just an instrument of execution, but a witness to cosmic events, a participant in divine revelation. For modern readers, This might seem fantastical or even absurd, but for second-century Christians steeped in apocalyptic imagery and supernatural thinking, such visions represented profound theological truths about the cosmic significance of Jesus' death and resurrection. The question we have to ask is why early church authorities found these supernatural elements so problematic. After all, the canonical Gospels contain their own miraculous accounts of the resurrection. Angels appear to the women at the tomb. Jesus appears and disappears at will. The dead rise from their graves in Matthew's account. Why were the spectacular elements in the Gospel of Peter considered unacceptable while similar miraculous claims in other Gospels were embraced? The answer lies in understanding the delicate balance that early church leaders were trying to maintain between the supernatural and the credible, between divine mystery and theological control. The Gospel of Peter's resurrection account was simply too dramatic, too public, too impossible to ignore or explain away. If Jesus had truly emerged as a giant visible to crowds of witnesses, if a cross had literally walked and talked, then the resurrection would have been an undeniable public spectacle rather than a private revelation to believers. Early church fathers understood that such claims would make Christianity vulnerable to mockery from educated critics and skeptical observers. The more restrained accounts in the canonical Gospels allowed for resurrection belief, while maintaining enough ambiguity to protect the faith from ridicule. The Gospel of Peter's supernatural excess threatened to make Christianity look like primitive superstition rather than sophisticated theology. But there was another, perhaps more important reason for suppressing this forbidden gospel. The document's theological implications extended far beyond its spectacular resurrection narrative. By presenting Jesus as immune to genuine suffering and portraying his crucifixion as essentially theatrical, the Gospel of Peter undermined key doctrines that church authorities were desperately trying to establish. The early church was locked in intense theological battles over the nature of Christ's humanity. Against various Gnostic and Docetic groups who claimed Jesus was purely divine, Orthodox leaders insisted that Jesus was fully human as well as fully divine. This doctrine of the Incarnation was essential for maintaining that Jesus' death could serve as genuine atonement for human sin. If Jesus didn't truly suffer as a human being, then his sacrifice lost its redemptive power. The Gospel of Peter's suggestion that Jesus felt no pain during his crucifixion aligned dangerously with Docetic teachings that church authorities were working to condemn. By the late 2nd century, as bishops like Serapion of Antioch began investigating the theological content of texts circulating in Christian communities, the Gospel of Peter was identified as promoting heretical ideas about Christ's nature. Serapion's rejection of the Gospel of Peter around 190 CE marked a crucial moment in the development of Christian orthodoxy. In his letter to the church at Rosses, Serapion explained that while he had initially allowed the Gospel to be read, further investigation revealed that it contained Docetic elements that corrupted proper understanding of Christ's humanity. His condemnation effectively ended the Gospel's circulation in mainstream Christian communities. This suppression reveals something crucial about how early Christianity developed its theological boundaries. The process wasn't simply about preserving authentic apostolic teaching versus rejecting later innovations. It was about making strategic choices about which interpretations of Jesus' story would serve the institutional needs of the growing church. The Gospel of Peter represented a form of Christianity that was too supernatural for educated critics, too Docetic for Orthodox theology, and too politically problematic in its anti-Jewish emphasis. By eliminating this alternative passion narrative, church authorities could shape Christian understanding of the crucifixion and resurrection in ways that supported their theological and institutional agenda. But the suppression of this forbidden gospel had consequences that extended far beyond theological debates. By eliminating texts like the Gospel of Peter, early church authorities narrowed the range of acceptable Christian belief and practice. They created a more uniform, but also more limited understanding of Jesus' story, one that served institutional purposes, but may have obscured other dimensions of early Christian experience and belief. The recovery of the Gospel of Peter in the 19th century opened a window into this suppressed dimension of early Christianity. It showed us a form of faith that was more mystical, more supernatural, more willing to embrace spectacular divine interventions than the Christianity preserved in canonical texts. Whether we accept its theological claims or not, this forbidden gospel represents an important witness to the diversity of early Christian belief and the complex process by which orthodoxy was established. As we continue our investigation into this banned text, we'll discover even more shocking details about how it portrays the relationship between Jesus and his disciples, the role of women in the crucifixion narrative, and the political implications of its anti-Jewish themes. What we've uncovered so far about the Gospel of Peter's supernatural elements and theological controversies is just the beginning. Because hidden within this forbidden text are details about the disciples' behavior during the crucifixion that paint a dramatically different picture from the canonical accounts. And these details reveal something troubling about how early Christian communities understood loyalty, betrayal, and the human cost of following Jesus. In the canonical Gospels, we're told that most of the disciples fled when Jesus was arrested, with only John remaining at the cross alongside the women. Peter, of course, denies knowing Jesus 3 times before the crucifixion. These accounts present the disciples as flawed, but ultimately redeemable human beings, who struggled with fear and doubt in their darkest hour. But the Gospel of Peter tells a different story entirely. According to this banned text, the disciples didn't just abandon Jesus out of fear. They went into hiding because they were being actively hunted by the authorities as criminals and revolutionaries. The Gospel states that the disciples were mourning and weeping night and day until the Sabbath. But more significantly, it reveals that they were sought after as malefactors and as those who wanted to burn the temple. Think about the implications of this claim. The Gospel of Peter isn't just describing disciples who ran away in panic. It's describing men who were seen as dangerous political threats, potential temple destroyers, enemies of the established order. This portrayal transforms the crucifixion from a religious execution into a political crackdown, with Jesus' followers viewed not as harmless spiritual seekers, but as revolutionary conspirators. This political dimension becomes even more pronounced when we examine how the Gospel of Peter describes the relationship between the disciples and the Jewish authorities. Unlike the canonical accounts, which focus primarily on the religious leaders' opposition to Jesus' teachings, this forbidden gospel presents a scenario where the disciples themselves are marked for persecution. They're not just followers of a controversial teacher. They're members of what appears to be a movement that posed a genuine threat to political stability. The Gospel of Peter's description of the disciples' fear takes on new meaning when we understand they weren't just afraid of being associated with a condemned criminal. They were afraid of being executed themselves as political insurgents. This context helps explain why they remained hidden even after the resurrection appearances began. They weren't just processing grief and confusion. They were fugitives from justice. But perhaps the most shocking aspect of the Gospel of Peter's portrayal of the disciples concerns how it handles the question of their faith during the crucifixion itself. The canonical Gospels suggest that while the disciples abandoned Jesus physically, they maintained some level of belief in who he was, even if that faith was severely tested. The Gospel of Peter suggests something far more devastating. According to this banned text, the disciples' crisis wasn't just about fear or disappointment. It was about complete theological collapse. They had believed Jesus was the Messiah, the one who would restore Israel and establish God's kingdom. When they saw him dying on the cross, apparently helpless and defeated, their entire worldview crumbled. The gospel doesn't just show them hiding from persecution. It shows them wrestling with the possibility that everything they had believed about Jesus was fundamentally wrong. This psychological realism in the Gospel of Peter creates a more complex and arguably more human portrait of the disciples than we find in the canonical accounts. Instead of men who simply needed to have their faith restored, we see individuals who had to rebuild their entire understanding of reality. The resurrection wasn't just a reunion with their beloved teacher. It was a cosmic vindication that required them to completely reconceptualize what they thought they knew about God, power, and the nature of divine intervention in human history. The Forbidden Gospel's treatment of the women at the crucifixion presents equally fascinating departures from canonical tradition. While the canonical Gospels consistently portray women as more faithful than the male disciples, remaining at the cross and being first to discover the empty tomb, the Gospel of Peter adds layers of detail that reveal the social and political complexities these women faced. According to this banned text, the women who followed Jesus weren't just demonstrating personal loyalty. They were defying social expectations and potentially endangering themselves by their public association with a condemned criminal. The Gospel suggests that their presence at the crucifixion was seen as scandalous by the broader community, marking them as supporters of someone the authorities had declared an enemy of the people. More intriguingly, the Gospel of Peter hints that these women possessed knowledge about Jesus' mission that even the male disciples didn't fully understand. While the men are portrayed as shocked and devastated by the crucifixion, the women seem to have expected something like this outcome. They're prepared with burial spices and seem less surprised by the supernatural events surrounding the resurrection. This suggests that the Gospel of Peter preserves a tradition in which women were not just faithful followers, but informed participants in Jesus' movement. They weren't simply supporting a teacher they admired. They were part of an inner circle that understood the dangerous political implications of Jesus' ministry and were prepared for the violent response it might provoke. The banned Gospel's portrayal of Mary Magdalene is particularly striking in this regard. Unlike the canonical accounts, which focus primarily on her presence at the crucifixion and her role in discovering the empty tomb, the Gospel of Peter presents her as someone who seems to understand the cosmic significance of what's happening. She's not just grieving a beloved teacher. She's witnessing the fulfillment of a divine plan that she apparently comprehended better than the male disciples. This elevated portrayal of Mary Magdalene in the Gospel of Peter aligns with other early Christian texts that were eventually suppressed, suggesting that there was a strand of early Christianity that recognized women as spiritual authorities equal to or even superior to the male apostles. The systematic suppression of these texts reveals how the developing institutional church worked to marginalize women's voices and establish male-dominated hierarchies. But the Gospel of Peter's most controversial element isn't its portrayal of disciples or women. It's the theological implications of its supernatural resurrection account. Implications that struck at the very heart of early Christian debates about the nature of salvation itself. When the Forbidden Gospel describes Jesus emerging from the tomb as a giant followed by a talking cross, it's not just providing spectacular imagery, it's making a profound theological statement about the cosmic significance of the resurrection. This isn't just a dead man coming back to life. This is a divine being revealing his true nature after temporarily concealing it in human form. The Docetic implications of this portrayal become clear when we consider what it means for Jesus to emerge in supernatural form. If Jesus was truly human, if he genuinely died as a human being, then his resurrection should restore him to human form, albeit glorified and transformed. But the Gospel of Peter's giant Jesus suggests something different. It suggests that death stripped away the illusion of humanity and revealed the divine being who had been temporarily disguised in human flesh. This theological interpretation had profound implications for how early Christians understood salvation. If Jesus was never truly human, if his suffering was essentially theatrical, then his death couldn't serve as genuine atonement for human sin. The entire sacrificial theology that would become central to Orthodox Christianity depended on Jesus being authentically human, genuinely suffering, truly dying as a substitute for humanity. The Gospel of Peter's Docetic elements threatened to undermine this sacrificial understanding of salvation. Instead of a human Savior who died for human sins, it presented a divine being who performed a cosmic drama to reveal spiritual truths. Salvation in this model wouldn't come through accepting Jesus' sacrifice, but through understanding the spiritual realities that his death and resurrection symbolized. This alternative soteriology explains why church authorities found the Gospel of Peter so dangerous. It wasn't just that the text contained spectacular supernatural elements. It was that these elements supported a completely different understanding of what Christianity was supposed to accomplish. Instead of a religion focused on sin, guilt, and sacrificial atonement, the Gospel of Peter pointed toward a more mystical faith centered on spiritual knowledge and cosmic revelation. The talking cross in the Gospel of Peter serves as a perfect symbol of this theological alternative. In canonical Christianity, the cross becomes the symbol of Jesus' sacrificial death, the instrument through which atonement is accomplished. But in the Gospel of Peter, the cross becomes a living witness to cosmic events, a participant in divine revelation, rather than simply a tool of execution. When the cross speaks in this forbidden gospel, answering questions about Jesus' ministry to the dead, it transforms from a symbol of suffering into a symbol of cosmic knowledge. The focus shifts from what Jesus endured on the cross to what the cross reveals about spiritual realities. This theological reorientation would have made the Gospel of Peter attractive to Christians who were more interested in mystical understanding than moral transformation. The suppression of texts like the Gospel of Peter reveals how early church authorities made strategic decisions about which theological interpretations would serve their institutional needs. The Docetic Christianity reflected in this forbidden gospel was too mystical, too focused on spiritual knowledge, too removed from human moral concerns to support the kind of organized religion that church leaders were trying to build. By eliminating alternatives like the Gospel of Peter, early church authorities could shape Christianity into a religion that emphasized moral behavior, institutional authority, and collective identity, rather than individual mystical experience. They created a more manageable, but also more limited form of faith, one that could be organized into hierarchical structures and controlled through doctrinal orthodoxy. But the cost of this suppression was the loss of other dimensions of early Christian experience. The Gospel of Peter preserves a witness to forms of faith that were more supernatural, more mystical, more willing to embrace radical theological possibilities than the Christianity that survived in canonical texts. Whether we accept its specific claims or not, This forbidden gospel represents an important reminder of the diversity that existed in early Christian communities. The political implications of the Gospel of Peter's anti-Jewish emphasis reveal another dimension of why this text was eventually suppressed. While the Gospel's shift of blame from Pilate to Herod might have made Christianity more acceptable to Roman audiences in the 2nd century, by the 4th century, when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, such crude anti-Jewish polemic became politically problematic. The canonical Gospels contain their own anti-Jewish elements, but they're more subtle and theologically sophisticated than the blunt hostility found in the Gospel of Peter. As Christianity evolved from a persecuted minority to an imperial religion, church authorities needed texts that could support complex relationships with both Jewish communities and Roman political power. The Gospel of Peter's theological crudeness made it unsuitable for this more sophisticated political environment. The discovery and recovery of the Gospel of Peter in modern times has opened new windows into understanding how early Christianity developed its theological and institutional boundaries. This forbidden text shows us that the Christianity we inherited wasn't the only possible outcome of early Christian development. Alternative forms of the faith existed, thrived for a time, and were then systematically eliminated as institutional Christianity consolidated its power. Understanding the full implications of the Gospel of Peter's suppression requires us to examine how it challenges one of Christianity's most fundamental doctrines, the nature of Jesus' death itself. Because what this forbidden text suggests about the crucifixion goes far beyond supernatural spectacle or anti-Jewish sentiment. It strikes at the very heart of what Christians believe about suffering, sacrifice, and the meaning of salvation. In the canonical Gospels, Jesus' agony is central to the Passion narrative. We see him sweating blood in Gethsemane, crying out from the cross, experiencing the full weight of human suffering and divine abandonment. These details aren't just dramatic flourishes. They're theological necessities that establish Jesus' genuine humanity and his qualification to serve as humanity's representative before God. But the Gospel of Peter presents a radically different picture. When Jesus is being tortured and executed, the text describes him as maintaining an otherworldly calm, remaining silent not from stoic endurance, but because he genuinely doesn't experience the pain that would overwhelm an ordinary human being. This isn't just a different interpretation of the same events. This is a completely different understanding of who Jesus was and what his death accomplished. The theological earthquake this creates becomes clear when we consider what it means for Christian soteriology. If Jesus didn't truly suffer, if his human experience was essentially an illusion, then the entire foundation of substitutionary atonement collapses. How can someone who doesn't genuinely experience human limitation serve as humanity's representative? How can a death that isn't fully real provide genuine redemption for sins that are undeniably real? The Gospel of Peter's Docetic implications threaten to transform Christianity from a religion of redemption into a religion of revelation. Instead of focusing on what Jesus did for humanity through his sacrificial death, the emphasis would shift to what Jesus revealed about the nature of divine reality through his apparent death. Salvation wouldn't come through accepting Christ's sacrifice, but through understanding the spiritual truths that his cosmic drama illustrated. This alternative theological framework explains why early church fathers reacted so strongly against the Gospel of Peter. They weren't just protecting doctrinal purity for its own sake. They were defending a particular understanding of Christianity that made institutional religion necessary and meaningful. If salvation came through mystical knowledge rather than moral transformation, if individual revelation was more important than collective doctrine, then what role would organized churches play in believers' spiritual lives? The forbidden gospel's portrayal of the resurrection as a public spectacle witnessed by crowds creates additional problems for institutional Christianity. The canonical Gospels carefully limit resurrection appearances to believers and chosen witnesses. This privacy allows for faith while protecting the Church from demands for public verification. But the Gospel of Peter's giant Jesus emerging before Roman guards and Jewish elders turns the resurrection into undeniable historical fact rather than matter of faith. Think about the implications of this difference. If the resurrection had truly been as public and spectacular as the Gospel of Peter describes, then Christianity wouldn't be a religion requiring faith. It would be a historical fact that no rational person could deny. The talking cross bearing witness to cosmic events would have made Jesus' divine nature as obvious as the sunrise. Early church authorities understood that such claims made Christianity vulnerable to historical scrutiny and rational criticism. If Jesus had really emerged as a giant visible to crowds, where were the Roman historical records of such an unprecedented event? If a cross had literally walked and spoken, why didn't contemporary historians document this miracle? The Gospel of Peter's supernatural excess created more problems than it solved for a faith trying to establish intellectual respectability. But the forbidden gospel's most dangerous element wasn't its supernatural spectacle. It was how these miraculous details supported a form of Christianity that valued individual mystical experience over institutional authority. The talking cross that reveals cosmic secrets represents a direct line of divine communication that bypasses human religious hierarchy entirely. When divine truth comes through supernatural revelation rather than apostolic tradition, then bishops and church councils become unnecessary mediators. The Gospel of Peter preserves a strand of early Christianity that was more mystical, more individualistic, more focused on direct spiritual experience than the institutional religion that would eventually dominate. This mystical Christianity didn't need elaborate theological systems or hierarchical authority structures. It needed individuals capable of receiving and interpreting divine revelations, regardless of their official religious status. This theological democracy threatened the entire foundation of early church authority. If anyone could potentially receive direct revelations like the visions described in the Gospel of Peter, then what special authority did bishops claim? If mystical experience was more important than doctrinal knowledge, then what value did theological education provide? The forbidden gospel pointed toward a form of Christianity that would have made organized religion largely irrelevant. The suppression of the Gospel of Peter reveals how early church authorities made strategic choices about which theological interpretations would support their institutional agenda. They needed a Christianity that required expert interpretation, professional religious guidance, and collective institutional membership. The mystical alternative preserved in texts like the Gospel of Peter would have created a religion of individual seekers rather than organized congregations. By eliminating the Gospel of Peter and similar texts, church fathers narrowed the acceptable range of Christian belief and practice. They created theological boundaries that would channel spiritual energy into institutional forms rather than individual mystical exploration. This wasn't necessarily a cynical power grab. Many church leaders genuinely believed that institutional Christianity provided stability and guidance that purely individual spirituality couldn't offer. But the cost of this institutional focus was the loss of other dimensions of early Christian experience. The Gospel of Peter shows us a form of faith that was more comfortable with supernatural mystery, more willing to embrace radical theological possibilities, more open to direct divine communication than the Christianity preserved in canonical texts. Whether we accept its specific claims or not, this forbidden gospel represents an important witness to suppressed aspects of early Christian spirituality. The political context surrounding the Gospel of Peter's suppression reveals another layer of complexity in early Christian development. The text's extreme anti-Jewish sentiment reflected broader tensions in second-century Christianity as the faith struggled to define its relationship with its Jewish origins. By making Herod and Jewish leaders the primary villains while portraying Pilate as reluctant and sympathetic, the Gospel of Peter attempted to distance Christianity from Judaism while making it more acceptable to Roman authorities. This political calculation made sense in the 2nd century, when Christians were still a persecuted minority seeking legitimacy within the Roman Empire. But by the 4th century, when Christianity had become the official imperial religion, such crude anti-Jewish polemic created diplomatic problems. The canonical Gospels contained their own anti-Jewish elements, but they were more theologically sophisticated and politically manageable than the blunt hostility found in the Gospel of Peter. The evolution of Christian attitudes toward the Gospel of Peter reflects the broader transformation of Christianity from a diverse collection of local communities into a unified imperial religion. Early church authorities had to make difficult choices about which texts and traditions would serve the needs of an increasingly powerful and politically significant religious institution. The Gospel of Peter's theological crudeness and political extremism made it unsuitable for this more sophisticated institutional environment. Church leaders needed texts that could support complex theological arguments and nuanced political relationships. The forbidden Gospel's spectacular supernaturalism and crude anti-Jewish themes were too primitive for the intellectual and political demands of imperial Christianity. But the suppression of the Gospel of Peter had consequences that extended far beyond theological and political considerations. By eliminating this alternative passion narrative, early church authorities also eliminated a form of Christianity that might have developed very different attitudes toward suffering, authority, and the nature of divine intervention in human history. The canonical passion narratives emphasize Jesus' genuine human suffering and create a model of redemption through sacrificial pain. This theological framework has shaped Christian attitudes toward suffering for nearly 2 millennia, encouraging believers to find meaning in their pain and to understand hardship as potentially redemptive. The Gospel of Peter's suggestion that Jesus didn't truly suffer could have led to very different Christian approaches to human suffering and divine justice. Similarly, the forbidden Gospel's emphasis on direct divine revelation and cosmic spectacle might have produced a form of Christianity more open to ongoing supernatural intervention and individual mystical experience. Instead of a religion focused on historical events and doctrinal interpretation, Christianity might have developed as a more mystical faith centered on continuing divine communication and supernatural encounter. The recovery of the Gospel of Peter in modern times has opened new possibilities for understanding these suppressed dimensions of early Christian experience. While we can't recreate the alternative forms of Christianity that were eliminated through institutional suppression, we can at least recognize that the faith we inherited represents one possible outcome among many that existed in the early Christian centuries. The forbidden gospel challenges us to consider what was lost when early church authorities chose institutional stability over mystical diversity, doctrinal orthodoxy over theological creativity, and political acceptability over supernatural authenticity. These weren't necessarily wrong choices, but they were choices that shaped Christianity in particular directions, while eliminating other possibilities. As we continue our investigation into the Gospel of Peter, we'll discover how its unique portrayal of the disciples' psychological state during the crucifixion reveals the human cost of following a leader whose mission culminated in apparent failure. We'll examine how the text's treatment of Jesus' burial and resurrection reflects early Christian attempts to understand the cosmic significance of these events. And we'll explore how the forbidden gospel's suppression fits into broader patterns of how religious institutions manage uncomfortable truths and challenging alternatives. What we've uncovered so far about the Gospel of Peter's Docetic theology and supernatural elements is just the foundation for understanding why this text was considered so dangerous to early Christian orthodoxy. The Forbidden Gospel doesn't just present alternative details about familiar events. It preserves an entirely different understanding of what Christianity was supposed to accomplish and how divine truth was supposed to be communicated to humanity. The talking cross that emerges from Jesus' tomb represents more than just spectacular imagery. It symbolizes a form of divine communication that operates outside human religious authority, offering direct access to cosmic secrets without requiring institutional mediation. This theological democracy threatened to make organized Christianity unnecessary by suggesting that divine truth was available to anyone capable of receiving supernatural revelation. But perhaps the most subversive element in the Gospel of Peter isn't its supernatural spectacle or its docetic theology. It's how these elements combine to create a vision of Christianity that values mystical experience over moral behavior, cosmic revelation over historical fact, and individual spiritual development over collective religious identity. This alternative Christianity might have produced very different believers than the institutional faith that eventually dominated. The suppression of the Gospel of Peter reveals the complex process by which early Christianity defined its theological and institutional boundaries. Church authorities didn't just preserve authentic apostolic teaching against later corruptions. They made strategic choices about which interpretations of Jesus' story would serve their vision of what Christianity should become. The forbidden gospel that emerged from the Egyptian desert offers us a glimpse into the road not taken, the form of Christianity that might have developed if mystical experience had remained central rather than becoming marginalized. Whether we accept its theological claims or not, the Gospel of Peter reminds us that the faith we inherited was shaped by very human decisions about divine truth, decisions that eliminated alternatives we can only imagine. The implications of what we've discovered about the Gospel of Peter's supernatural elements extend far beyond ancient theological debates, because hidden within this forbidden text are details about the cosmic battle that supposedly raged during Jesus' crucifixion, details that present the Passion not as a simple execution, but as a supernatural war between divine and demonic forces for control of human destiny. The canonical Gospels hint at spiritual dimensions surrounding the crucifixion. We read about darkness covering the land, the temple veil tearing, and dead saints rising from their graves. But these supernatural elements remain relatively restrained, open to various interpretations, and focused primarily on their symbolic meaning rather than their cosmic implications. The Gospel of Peter transforms these subtle hints into a full-scale supernatural drama. According to this banned text, the crucifixion wasn't just a Roman execution happening in first-century Palestine. It was the climactic battle in a cosmic war that had been raging since the foundation of the world, with spiritual forces using human agents to accomplish their supernatural purposes. This cosmic perspective explains why the Gospel of Peter portrays the Jewish leaders with such extreme hostility. They're not just religious authorities opposing a teacher they find threatening. They're unwitting servants of dark spiritual forces determined to destroy the divine plan for human redemption. Their bloodthirsty determination to see Jesus executed isn't merely human malice. It's supernatural evil working through human instruments. Similarly, the Roman soldiers who carry out the crucifixion aren't just following orders. They're participants in a cosmic drama whose true significance they can't comprehend. When they mock Jesus and gamble for his clothes, they're unknowingly fulfilling supernatural prophecies while serving as instruments of both divine justice and demonic malice. But perhaps the most striking aspect of the Gospel of Peter's cosmic perspective is how it portrays Jesus' response to this supernatural warfare. Unlike the canonical accounts, which show Jesus struggling with his approaching death in Gethsemane and crying out in anguish from the cross, this forbidden gospel presents him as serenely confident throughout his ordeal. This isn't just stoic endurance or divine courage. The Gospel of Peter suggests that Jesus remained calm because he possessed knowledge about the cosmic battle that others didn't have. He understood that what appeared to be his defeat was actually the crucial moment in a divine strategy that would ultimately triumph over the forces of darkness. The text's description of Jesus being silent, as if he felt no pain, takes on new meaning when understood in this cosmic context. It's not that Jesus was physically incapable of suffering. It's that his awareness of the supernatural dimensions of what was happening transcended ordinary human responses to pain and humiliation. He was operating on a level of consciousness that made physical suffering irrelevant to his true mission. This portrayal of Jesus as cosmically aware during his crucifixion reflects early Christian attempts to understand how a divine being could willingly submit to human execution. If Jesus was truly God, then his death couldn't have been a defeat or even a sacrifice in the ordinary sense. It had to be a strategic move in a larger cosmic game whose rules and objectives transcended human understanding. The Gospel of Peter's cosmic perspective becomes even more pronounced in its account of Jesus' descent into hell between his death and resurrection. While the canonical Gospels remain silent about what happened during the 3 days Jesus spent in the tomb, this forbidden text provides detailed descriptions of supernatural encounters in the realm of the dead. According to the Gospel of Peter, Jesus' death wasn't the end of his earthly mission, but the beginning of his cosmic mission. His spirit descended into the underworld, not as a defeated victim, but as a conquering hero, breaking down the gates of hell and liberating the righteous dead who had been imprisoned there since the foundation of the world. This descent into hell isn't just a rescue mission. It's the completion of a cosmic plan that required divine intervention in the realm of the dead. The Gospel of Peter suggests that death itself had been holding humanity hostage, preventing even the righteous from reaching their eternal reward. Jesus' death and descent broke this supernatural bondage, opening the way for all subsequent believers to bypass hell and enter directly into divine presence. The talking cross that emerges from Jesus' tomb serves as a witness to these cosmic events. When heavenly voices question the cross about Jesus' ministry to the dead, the cross confirms that the mission was successful, that the righteous have been liberated, and that the cosmic balance of power has shifted decisively in favor of divine justice. This dialogue between heaven and the cross reveals the Gospel of Peter's understanding of the resurrection as primarily a cosmic rather than historical event. While the canonical Gospels focus on Jesus' return to life and his appearances to disciples, this forbidden text emphasizes the universal implications of what has been accomplished through his death and resurrection. The giant Jesus who emerges from the tomb isn't just a resurrected human being. He's a cosmic figure whose supernatural proportions reflect his victory over the forces that had held humanity in spiritual bondage. His enormous size symbolizes the expansion of divine authority into realms that had previously been controlled by dark spiritual powers. But this cosmic victory comes at a theological cost that early church authorities found unacceptable. If Jesus' death was primarily a cosmic event rather than a historical sacrifice, then what role does human moral behavior play in salvation? If divine victory was accomplished through supernatural warfare rather than substitutionary atonement, then how do individual believers participate in redemption? The Gospel of Peter's cosmic perspective threatens to make Christianity irrelevant to ordinary human moral concerns. If salvation was accomplished through supernatural battles in spiritual realms, then human ethical behavior becomes secondary to understanding cosmic truths. This theological shift would have transformed Christianity from a religion focused on moral transformation into a religion focused on mystical knowledge. Early church fathers understood that this cosmic Christianity would be difficult to organize into stable institutional structures. How do you create church hierarchies based on cosmic awareness? How do you establish doctrinal authority over supernatural revelations? How do you maintain congregational unity when individual believers claim direct access to cosmic truths? The suppression of the Gospel of Peter was part of a broader campaign to keep Christianity focused on historical events and moral behavior rather than cosmic speculation and mystical experience. Church authorities needed a religion that could be taught through systematic theology and managed through institutional authority. The cosmic Christianity preserved in this forbidden gospel would have been too mystical and too individualistic for such institutional control. But the elimination of the Gospel of Peter's cosmic perspective had consequences that shaped Christianity's development in ways that continue to influence the faith today. By focusing primarily on historical events and moral implications, institutional Christianity lost much of its supernatural dimension. The cosmic warfare that the Gospel of Peter describes became relegated to abstract theological speculation rather than lived spiritual reality. Modern Christians often struggle to understand how their personal moral behavior connects to larger spiritual realities. The cosmic perspective preserved in the Gospel of Peter might have provided a framework for understanding individual spiritual development as participation in ongoing supernatural conflict between divine and demonic forces. The Forbidden Gospel's portrayal of Jesus as cosmically aware during his crucifixion also offers a different model for understanding how believers should respond to suffering and persecution. Instead of seeing hardship as divine punishment or character testing, the cosmic perspective suggests that human suffering often occurs when individuals become caught up in spiritual warfare beyond their comprehension. This understanding could have led to very different Christian attitudes toward persecution and martyrdom. Instead of seeing suffering as redemptive in itself, believers might have understood it as evidence of their participation in cosmic conflict, with their faithful endurance contributing to divine victory over supernatural evil. The Gospel of Peter's cosmic Christianity might also have developed different approaches to evangelism and mission. Instead of focusing primarily on individual moral conversion, cosmic Christianity would emphasize helping people understand their role in larger spiritual realities. Salvation wouldn't be just about personal redemption, but about conscious participation in divine victory over cosmic evil. The talking cross in the Gospel of Peter represents this cosmic perspective in its most dramatic form. The cross doesn't just serve as an instrument of execution or even a symbol of sacrifice. It becomes a conscious participant in cosmic events, a witness to supernatural realities that human observers couldn't fully comprehend. This animated cross challenges our understanding of the relationship between material and spiritual reality. In the Gospel of Peter's cosmic framework, the boundary between physical objects and spiritual forces becomes fluid. Matter itself can become conscious and participate in divine communication when caught up in cosmic events of sufficient magnitude. Such supernatural materialism would have led to very different Christian attitudes toward the physical world. Instead of seeing matter as fallen or corrupt, cosmic Christianity might have understood physical reality as potentially sacred, capable of participating in divine consciousness when aligned with cosmic purposes. The suppression of these cosmic elements in the Gospel of Peter reveals how early church authorities prioritized theological control over supernatural authenticity. They needed a Christianity that could be systematized and institutionalized, rather than one that remained open to ongoing cosmic revelation and supernatural intervention. But the cosmic perspective preserved in this forbidden gospel continues to challenge institutional Christianity's limitations. It reminds us that early Christian experience included dimensions of supernatural awareness that were deliberately eliminated from Orthodox tradition. Whether we accept the specific claims of the Gospel of Peter or not, its cosmic vision points toward aspects of spiritual reality that institutional religion often finds difficult to acknowledge or accommodate. The recovery of the Gospel of Peter in modern times coincides with growing interest in cosmic spirituality and supernatural dimensions of religious experience. Contemporary believers who feel constrained by purely historical and moral approaches to Christianity might find in this forbidden gospel a witness to more mystical and cosmic forms of faith that were once central to early Christian experience. The question we have to ask ourselves is whether we're prepared to engage with the cosmic implications of Christianity that the Gospel of Peter preserves. Are we ready to consider that the crucifixion might have had supernatural dimensions that transcend historical analysis? Can we embrace a vision of Christianity that sees individual spiritual development as participation in ongoing cosmic conflict between divine and demonic forces? The Gospel of Peter challenges us to expand our understanding of what Christianity might become if it reclaimed its cosmic vision. This doesn't require accepting every supernatural detail in the forbidden gospel, but it does require acknowledging that early Christian experience included dimensions of cosmic awareness that institutional religion has systematically marginalized or eliminated. The talking cross that emerges from Jesus' tomb represents more than just spectacular imagery. It symbolizes a form of Christianity that recognized divine presence and communication operating through unexpected channels, transcending the boundaries that institutional religion establishes between sacred and secular, spiritual and material, human and divine. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of the Gospel of Peter's cosmic perspective is how it forces us to reconsider the relationship between historical fact and spiritual truth. The forbidden gospel's supernatural elements weren't necessarily intended as literal historical descriptions. They were attempts to communicate cosmic realities that transcended ordinary historical categories. Early church authorities who suppressed the Gospel of Peter were concerned that its supernatural claims couldn't be historically verified and would make Christianity vulnerable to rational criticism. But this concern reveals their commitment to defending Christianity primarily as historical religion rather than cosmic spirituality. The Gospel of Peter suggests that the most important truths about Jesus' death and resurrection operate on cosmic rather than historical levels. Whether the crucifixion happened exactly as described in any particular gospel matters less than understanding the cosmic significance of divine intervention in human history. This cosmic approach to religious truth challenges contemporary Christianity's emphasis on historical apologetics and evidential faith. Instead of defending Christianity by proving that supernatural events actually happened as described, cosmic Christianity focuses on understanding what these events reveal about spiritual realities that transcend historical analysis. The Forbidden Gospel's cosmic perspective might offer contemporary believers a way to engage with Christian faith that doesn't depend on resolving historical and scientific questions about supernatural claims. Instead of arguing about whether crosses can literally talk or whether Jesus could emerge as a giant, cosmic Christianity focuses on what these images communicate about divine presence and power operating in dimensions beyond ordinary human perception. But embracing the cosmic vision preserved in the Gospel of Peter requires more than intellectual assent to supernatural possibilities. It requires developing forms of spiritual awareness that can perceive cosmic realities operating through historical events. This mystical dimension of Christianity was central to early Christian experience, but has been largely eliminated from institutional religious practice. The suppression of the Gospel of Peter represents the loss of this mystical dimension from mainstream Christianity. By eliminating texts that preserved cosmic perspectives and supernatural awareness, early church authorities created a more manageable but also more limited form of faith. They traded mystical authenticity for institutional control, cosmic vision for historical orthodoxy. The recovery of this forbidden gospel in modern times offers us an opportunity to reclaim what was lost when Christianity chose institutional stability over cosmic spirituality. Whether we're prepared to embrace that opportunity depends on our willingness to engage with dimensions of religious experience that transcend the boundaries institutional Christianity has established. The cosmic warfare that the Gospel of Peter describes wasn't just ancient mythology. It was an attempt to understand how divine and demonic forces operate through human history, using human agents to accomplish supernatural purposes. This cosmic perspective might offer contemporary believers frameworks for understanding how their personal spiritual development connects to larger spiritual realities operating beyond their immediate perception. The question that remains is whether modern Christianity is ready to reclaim the cosmic vision that the Gospel of Peter preserves. Are we prepared to understand our faith as participation in ongoing supernatural conflict between divine and demonic forces? Can we embrace forms of spiritual awareness that recognize cosmic realities operating through historical events? The forbidden gospel that was buried in the Egyptian desert offers us more than just alternative details about familiar Christian stories. It offers us access to dimensions of spiritual reality that institutional Christianity has systematically eliminated from Orthodox tradition. The talking cross that emerges from Jesus' tomb continues to speak to anyone willing to listen to suppressed voices from Christian history. But hearing what the Gospel of Peter has to say requires more than historical curiosity about early Christian diversity. It requires openness to cosmic possibilities that challenge the limitations institutional Christianity has placed on supernatural experience and mystical awareness. The question is whether we're ready for that challenge. The implications we've uncovered about the Gospel of Peter's cosmic warfare and supernatural elements bring us to perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this forbidden text. Because hidden within its dramatic resurrection account lies something that early church authorities found even more threatening than talking crosses or giant saviors. The Gospel of Peter doesn't just challenge how we understand Jesus' death and resurrection. It fundamentally undermines the entire theological framework that institutional Christianity was desperately trying to establish. When we examine the Gospel of Peter's portrayal of Jesus' suffering, we discover something that should have revolutionized Christian understanding of divine incarnation, but instead was buried so deep that most believers have never encountered it. The text's repeated emphasis that Jesus remained silent, as if he felt no pain, wasn't just describing supernatural endurance. It was making a radical theological claim that struck at the very foundation of Christian soteriology. Think about what this means for the doctrine of atonement. The entire sacrificial theology that became central to Orthodox Christianity depends on Jesus genuinely experiencing human suffering as humanity's representative. If Jesus didn't truly suffer, if his agony was essentially an illusion, then his death couldn't serve as authentic substitution for human sin. The Gospel of Peter's Docetic implications threatened to collapse the theological house of cards that church fathers were carefully constructing. But the forbidden gospel goes even further in its theological radicalism. When it describes Jesus emerging from the tomb as a supernatural giant, it's not just providing spectacular imagery. It's suggesting that death stripped away the illusion of Jesus' humanity and revealed the divine being who had been temporarily concealed in human form. This portrayal implies that Jesus' entire earthly existence was essentially a cosmic performance rather than genuine incarnation. The theological earthquake this creates becomes apparent when we consider its implications for human salvation. If Jesus was never truly human, then how can his experience bridge the gap between divine and human nature? How can someone who only appeared to share human limitations serve as humanity's representative before God? The Gospel of Peter's supernatural Jesus threatens to make salvation a matter of understanding cosmic truths rather than accepting sacrificial atonement. This alternative soteriology explains why early church authorities reacted with such alarm to the Gospel of Peter's circulation. They weren't just protecting doctrinal purity for abstract reasons. They were defending a particular understanding of Christianity that made institutional religion necessary and meaningful. If salvation came through mystical knowledge of cosmic realities rather than moral transformation through sacrificial grace, then what role would organized churches play in believers' spiritual development? The Forbidden Gospel's portrayal of the talking cross creates additional problems for institutional Christianity. When the cross begins speaking and answering questions about cosmic events, it represents direct divine communication that bypasses all human religious authority. This supernatural revelation doesn't require apostolic succession, episcopal approval, or doctrinal interpretation. It's immediate, accessible, and independent of institutional mediation. Consider how threatening this concept was to early church leaders who were working to establish their exclusive authority over Christian truth. If crosses could speak directly about divine mysteries, if cosmic revelations were available to anyone present at supernatural events, then what special qualification did bishops and priests possess? The Gospel of Peter's talking cross threatened to make religious hierarchy irrelevant by demonstrating that divine truth could be communicated through unexpected channels. The Forbidden Gospel's supernatural elements also challenge fundamental assumptions about the relationship between faith and evidence. The canonical Gospels carefully limit resurrection appearances to believers and chosen witnesses, requiring faith to bridge the gap between limited evidence and ultimate truth. But the Gospel of Peter's giant Jesus emerging before crowds of witnesses turns the resurrection into undeniable public spectacle rather than matter of faith. This transformation from faith-based to evidence-based religion would have completely altered Christianity's character and appeal. If Jesus had truly emerged as a supernatural giant visible to Roman guards and Jewish leaders, then Christianity wouldn't require faith at all. It would be historical fact that rational people couldn't deny. The talking cross bearing witness to cosmic events would have made Jesus' divine nature as obvious as physical law. Early church authorities understood that such claims made Christianity vulnerable to historical scrutiny that it couldn't survive. If Jesus had really emerged as a giant witnessed by crowds, where were the Roman records of such an unprecedented event? If crosses had literally walked and spoken, why didn't contemporary historians document these miracles? The Gospel of Peter's supernatural excess created more problems than it solved for a faith trying to establish intellectual respectability. But perhaps the most subversive element in the Gospel of Peter isn't its spectacular imagery or Docetic theology. It's how these elements combine to create a vision of Christianity that values direct mystical experience over institutional authority. The cosmic revelations and supernatural encounters described in this forbidden text point toward a form of faith that would have made organized religion largely unnecessary. When divine truth comes through talking crosses and cosmic visions, rather than apostolic tradition and doctrinal teaching, then individual spiritual experience becomes more important than collective religious identity. When salvation depends on understanding cosmic mysteries rather than accepting institutional doctrine, then personal revelation matters more than ecclesiastical authority. The Gospel of Peter preserves a strand of early Christianity that was fundamentally mystical and individualistic, rather than institutional and collective. This mystical Christianity would have developed very differently from the organized religion that eventually dominated. Instead of hierarchical structures and systematic theology, it would have emphasized individual spiritual development and direct divine encounter. Instead of focusing on moral behavior and doctrinal orthodoxy, it would have prioritized cosmic awareness and supernatural experience. The suppression of the Gospel of Peter reveals how early church authorities made strategic choices about which theological interpretations would serve their institutional agenda. They needed a Christianity that required expert interpretation, professional guidance, and collective membership. The mystical alternative preserved in this forbidden gospel would have created a religion of individual seekers rather than organized congregations. By eliminating texts like the Gospel of Peter, Church Fathers narrowed the acceptable range of Christian belief and practice. They created theological boundaries that would channel spiritual energy into institutional forms rather than individual mystical exploration. This wasn't necessarily cynical manipulation. Many church leaders genuinely believed that institutional Christianity provided stability and guidance that purely individual spirituality couldn't offer. But the cost of this institutional focus was the loss of other dimensions of early Christian experience. The Gospel of Peter shows us a form of faith that was more comfortable with supernatural mystery, more willing to embrace radical theological possibilities, more open to direct divine communication than the Christianity preserved in canonical texts. The Forbidden Gospel's extreme anti-Jewish sentiment reflects another dimension of why this text was eventually suppressed. While shifting blame from Pilate to Herod might have made Christianity more acceptable to Roman audiences in the 2nd century, by the 4th century, such crude anti-Jewish polemic had become politically problematic for an imperial religion. The canonical Gospels contain their own anti-Jewish elements, but they're more theologically sophisticated and politically manageable than the blunt hostility found in the Gospel of Peter. As Christianity evolved from persecuted minority to official imperial religion, church authorities needed texts that could support complex theological arguments and nuanced political relationships. The Gospel of Peter's theological crudeness and political extremism made it unsuitable for this more sophisticated institutional environment. Church leaders required texts that could serve the intellectual and diplomatic demands of imperial Christianity, rather than the survival needs of an underground religious movement. The discovery of the Gospel of Peter in that Egyptian tomb wasn't just an archaeological find. It was the resurrection of suppressed voices that challenge everything we thought we knew about early Christian development. This forbidden text shows us that the Christianity we inherited wasn't the inevitable outcome of apostolic teaching. It was one possible result among many alternatives that existed, thrived, and were then systematically eliminated. Understanding the full implications of what was lost when the Gospel of Peter was suppressed requires us to imagine what Christianity might have become if mystical experience had remained central rather than becoming marginalized. If women had been allowed to claim spiritual authority equal to men, if direct divine revelation had been valued alongside apostolic tradition, if supernatural encounter had been emphasized rather than minimized, the talking cross that emerges from Jesus' tomb in this forbidden gospel represents more than spectacular imagery. It symbolizes a form of Christianity that recognized divine presence operating through unexpected channels, transcending the boundaries that institutional religion establishes between sacred and secular, spiritual and material, authorized and unauthorized. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of the Gospel of Peter for contemporary believers isn't its supernatural claims or theological radicalism. It's how this forbidden text forces us to confront the possibility that the Christianity we've inherited represents a diminished version of what the faith originally offered. That institutional concerns led early church authorities to eliminate dimensions of spiritual experience that were central to early Christian life. The cosmic warfare described in the Gospel of Peter wasn't just ancient mythology. It was an attempt to understand how divine and demonic forces operate through human history, using human agents to accomplish supernatural purposes. This cosmic perspective might offer contemporary believers frameworks for understanding how personal spiritual development connects to larger spiritual realities operating beyond immediate perception. The Docetic elements in the Gospel of Peter, while theologically problematic for Orthodox Christianity, point toward mysteries about the relationship between divine and human nature that purely human theological categories cannot adequately address. Instead of dismissing these elements as heretical error, we might consider them as attempts to express spiritual truths that transcend ordinary religious language. The Forbidden Gospel's emphasis on direct revelation and supernatural encounter challenges contemporary Christianity's focus on historical apologetics and evidential faith. Instead of defending Christianity by proving that specific events happened exactly as described, the Gospel of Peter suggests that spiritual truth operates on levels that transcend historical verification. This approach to religious truth might offer contemporary believers ways to engage with Christian faith that don't depend on resolving scientific and historical questions about supernatural claims. Instead of arguing about whether crosses can literally talk or whether Jesus could emerge as a giant, we might focus on what these images communicate about divine presence and power operating in dimensions beyond ordinary perception. But embracing the vision preserved in the Gospel of Peter requires more than intellectual curiosity about alternative Christian traditions. It requires openness to forms of spiritual awareness that institutional Christianity has systematically eliminated from Orthodox practice. It demands willingness to engage with mystical dimensions of faith that transcend the boundaries organized religion has established. The recovery of this forbidden gospel in modern times coincides with growing spiritual hunger for more authentic and transformative forms of religious experience. Contemporary believers who feel constrained by purely institutional approaches to Christianity might find in the Gospel of Peter a witness to more mystical and cosmic forms of faith that were once central to early Christian experience. The question we have to ask ourselves is whether we're prepared to engage with the full implications of what the Gospel of Peter preserves. Are we ready to consider that early Christianity included dimensions of supernatural awareness that were deliberately eliminated from Orthodox tradition? Can we embrace visions of faith that value mystical experience over institutional authority, cosmic revelation over historical orthodoxy? The Forbidden Gospel challenges us to expand our understanding of what Christianity might become if it reclaimed suppressed dimensions of spiritual experience. This doesn't require accepting every supernatural detail or theological claim in the text, but it does require acknowledging that early Christian experience included forms of cosmic awareness and mystical encounter that institutional religion has marginalized or eliminated. The talking cross that speaks cosmic secrets in the Gospel of Peter continues to challenge anyone willing to listen to suppressed voices from Christian history. But hearing what this forbidden gospel has to say requires more than historical interest in early Christian diversity. It requires openness to spiritual possibilities that transcend the limitations institutional Christianity has placed on supernatural experience and divine revelation. The Gospel of Peter reminds us that the Christianity we inherited was shaped by strategic choices about which theological interpretations would serve institutional needs rather than spiritual authenticity. By recovering this forbidden text, we gain access to suppressed dimensions of early Christian faith that might offer contemporary believers resources for spiritual development that organized religion has forgotten how to provide. The cosmic Jesus who emerges as a giant from the tomb represents more than just spectacular resurrection imagery. He symbolizes the unlimited spiritual potential that exists within Christianity when it's freed from institutional constraints and allowed to embrace its full mystical heritage. The question is whether modern believers are ready to encounter this suppressed Christ who transcends the boundaries that organized religion has established around divine presence and power. The forbidden gospel that was buried in the Egyptian desert for over 15 centuries offers us more than alternative details about familiar Christian stories. It offers us access to dimensions of spiritual reality that institutional Christianity eliminated from Orthodox tradition. Whether we're prepared to embrace that access depends on our willingness to engage with forms of faith that value transformation over conformity, revelation over regulation, and mystical authenticity over institutional authority. The Gospel of Peter stands as eternal testimony to the spiritual possibilities that were sacrificed when Christianity chose institutional control over mystical liberation. The talking cross continues to speak to anyone ready to hear suppressed truths about divine presence, operating beyond the boundaries of orthodox belief. The question that remains is whether we're ready to listen to what this forbidden voice has been trying to tell us across the centuries of its suppression. Across the centuries of its suppression.